this came to me. I call this some ideas because the last time, a couple of weeks ago, we were talking about the use of mathematics and the way mathematics can assist us in developing our ideas. But it's not only mathematics; it's also continue. It's also other paradigms and how they can interact with what you're looking at. And I developed the idea of Metacybernetics from the third order cybernetics that arose from Eric Schwartz. Other things I looked at and I've been working with is the work of Roy Frieden, who developed a statistical dynamics based on Fisher information. And I gave a presentation some weeks ago on general collective intelligence. So having explored those areas, noting that general collective intelligence has a tendency to move towards mathematics because it can use simulation and scenario generation in order to find general GCI indices. So the three are in some way related. So the first thing I did was to look at Eigenform, and I found some issues. If we go to the work of Forster, we find that he developed ideas, recursive ideas, that enabled the definition of eigenvalues and eigenbehavior. And I studied this for quite some while, trying to find out how it worked and how it could relate to other areas. And I also, many years ago, came across the work of Daniel Dubois, who was himself not too satisfied with the recursive structures that were produced by Forster. And in this presentation, I've related them. So let's go to the next presentation, the next slide. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. General collective intelligence, the presentation I gave before, was that basically it's all about autopoiesis. You've got a network of processes and you've got people trying to manifest, say, some sort of observation into an idea, into a scheme that can be evaluated. And you're looking at the intelligence processes that are connected. A man called Halpin in 2012 recognized that GCI was actually a form of autopoiesis. And what came to mind is that GCI is probably connected with some sort of efficacy that can be associated with autopoiesis. This general collective intelligence makes certain assumptions. It makes the assumption, for instance, that there are sub-agencies. I'm talking here in general, when I refer to an agency, I'm talking about an autonomous living system that has all the properties that you know. And then the network of processes that constitute autopoiesis are formed by the sub-agencies, all of which have functional attributes that result in processes that they're trying to create a result for or with. In general collective intelligence, these sub-agencies are distributed, and the idea in this paradigm is that people work together for what they call some sort of fitness scenario, where they're trying to generate sustainability and some sort of efficacy from their outputs. In other words, to generate a positive output from the relationships that they have. If we now move on to Eigenform, then Eigenform, if you refer to Rocher's work, he defines, I think, better than Forster, a set of recursive relationships. Now, here we have the first equation below, which is obs of t equals chord of obs of t minus 1. So it's effectively recursive, and it looks into historical processes. And when there's an eigen value being formed, we have an OI, the next equation, which is observation time t, and then there's a recursive set of coordinations. But the problem is, because we're looking at history, it looks like the recursive relationships don't actually only refer to internalization. So is it the case that Forster's ideas were really about internalization? And if they're about internalization and the creation of eigenvalues when the solution to this equation is stable, what happens? What's the relationship between eigenvalues and eigenbehavior? And indeed, what is eigenbehavior? Because if you go to different sources, you find different representations of them. So I proposed the notion of two types of autopoiesis. We've got anterior autopoiesis and we've got posterior autopoiesis. Anterior autopoiesis is where you get autopoietic processes that create internalization, which is what we have in this equation. And it looks like this is the cause when the equation is stable of creating eigenvalues. But how do we relate eigenvalues to eigenbehavior? Forster, Rocher, and others have not really discussed that. Rocher has gone to a lot of discussion relating to the dynamics of internalization and the dynamic system processes and how this results in the emergence, which results in eigenbehavior, but that doesn't really tell us too much. So then I brought in Daniel Dubois' work. Now, Daniel Dubois said that recursion isn't enough, and he introduced the term incursion. Now, incursion is really a penetration, and incursion is a time forward event as opposed to a time retrospective event, as Forster considered. So let us go to Dubois, and he reformulated Forster's equation like this: the y of t plus 1 equals blah, 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 with a parameter which really represents the context that we're looking at. And in in the theory I'm developing, context replaces object, because we can talk about subjects in interaction with objects and subjects in interaction with other subjects in an environment. And we can talk about observers observing those. And this is exactly what Piaget was doing when Forster picked up his work. But the issue here is that we need something that simplifies the language. And my view was, if we define context in an appropriate way, we could simplify how we speak about things. So now I talk about internalizing context, and that's really equivalent to internalizing what we observe with the subject interacting with the object. Now, after Dubois created a substitute equation for recursion, he then went on to define an alternative equation which represented incursion. And incursion is all about anticipation. Now, we all know that anticipation is all about living systems. So if we're talking about living systems, then necessarily we must be very specific about the fact that the agency or the system we're looking at has the property of anticipation. But Forster's equations don't represent that. Dubois do. Now, Dubois did something else. He said there are two forms of anticipation. There's what he called weak anticipation and strong anticipation. No, weak anticipation is really an information process. And it's equivalent in internalization to the dual process of assimilation and accommodation. Assimilation is when you have a model that you brought in into the cognitive system that you refer to in order to look at what is likely to be happening, whereas accommodation is where you take that model into your structure and it becomes a component of the system. So it doesn't have to refer to the model is part of it. So when it reacts to situations, it reacts using that model. In the same way, we've got weak and strong anticipation. Weak anticipation arises through assimilation, which is an information process, and strong anticipation is where the anticipation is part of the structure. So the two equations we have here, the bottom two equations from Dubois, are basically the same, except the y asterisk actually refers to some sort of expectation, whereas the y without the asterisk in the lower equation is not an expectation. It's actually a part of the process, part of the dynamic. Okay. So these are fundamental issues, and they really need further discussion. But it looks to me as though my proposition actually resolves the issues that were identified by Dubois and the lacks that were created in Forster's presentation. We can move on to extreme physical information, and that is another mathematical structure. It's like Metacybernetics. It's not a particular, a single theory. It's actually a general theory. And Roy Frieden has generated a whole host of theories from his theory in quantum mechanics, in economics, in biological systems, from the principles that he's defined that arise from Fisher information and his development of that. So basically, he proposes that there is any object, call it a context in my terms now, has bound information. And that bound information needs to be extracted in order to find out what the context is. So what you do is you observe the context and you acquire information from it. So you have J is the bound information within the context, and I is the extracted information. And he has an equation, y equals p plus x. Y is the data, p is some parameter, and x is a random variable, noise. And he's developed equations which define I. And he also finds that there's a kappa, a value, which actually ends up being efficacy. And that efficacy very much relates to the GCI measure that I referred to earlier. Normally, if you have a single agency, then kappa is a constant which is restricted to 1, and that only occurs in, say, quantum mechanics, where you have two quanta which are integrated, which are, I've forgotten the term. Anyway, normally in classical mechanics, in classical mechanics, you have kappa equals a half, so that you've got to limit the amount of information that you can acquire. However, if you've got social contexts and you've got n participants in that, they can all create information, which then goes into the pool, and kappa can be less than or equal to n. And there are some interesting possibilities with this theory. And there are, in the book that came out recently on mindset theory, I show how extreme physical information can actually be used to explore some aspects of mindset agency theory. So I think we have two more slides, but only one really that's of any value. Let us set this up into a third order agency model, the one I've been using variations of it for a long time. And it arises originally from the work of Eric Schwartz, who died some 6 years ago, and whose work, sadly, was never highly recognized, primarily because most of his presentations of this work were at conferences. And I came across his work first in 1994, and that's when I started working with it. So here we have a system which has an operative structure. We have a behavioral potential within that structure. In other words, the structure can generate behaviors. We have intention. We have a population of interactive agents. We may have, if one wants to believe that context maps exist there, a context map that defines the relationship between the system and the context. And we have self-organization processes. We also likely have eigenbehavior here. And eigenbehavior seems to be structural, because in one paper I read, they were talking about eigenbehavior being represented as the color of a flower or the shape of a tortoise shell or whatever it is. So it's structural in that sense, but any structure also has consequences for behavior, because any structure has a potential for behavior. there are other things that might interfere in whether or not behavior occurs. But if you look in the biological world, a giraffe has a structure and eats leaves. You wouldn't expect a lion to try and eat leaves as well because it has a different structure. So certain structures have certain behavioral potentials. Connected with the system is the metasystem. Jason, how am I doing for time?
2 more minutes.
4? Okay. I thought I'd be quicker than that. Okay. Okay, we've got a metasystem, which is cognition, schemas, etc., cognitive maps, self-regulation, and a meta-metasystem, which it could be a knowledge base, whatever. But here we have, between the system and the metasystem, we have autopoietic posterior imperatives, in other words, posterior autopoiesis as a first-order causal agent. And we have anterior autopoiesis, and that's a feedback. So it's through anterior autopoiesis that you get internalization, and it's through posterior autopoiesis that you get anticipation. Okay, I'm going to finish there because, oh, there's one more slide. I'm not going to go into it, but I'll just show you it's there. Oh, it's not there. Okay, I must have hidden it. There should be consequences for the, yeah, I must have hidden it. There are some propositions that arise that anyone who has these slides can look at, because the propositions using these various theories are then set out in various dimensions. Okay, that's it. Comments?
Yeah, comments and questions.
Yes, I would really like to see how you would state your propositions in a systematic way. You've introduced quite a number of mathematical concepts and terms and brought them together in a holistic way. But as a listener, an observer, I have a very difficult time separating out the fundamental propositions from which the arguments are developed. So yep. I really would like to see the propositions that you're talking about.
Okay, let me see if, hang on. Oh, how do I've lost it, hang on. Let me minimize this and try and find out where we are. Okay. Oh, can you see this?
Not yet.
No, okay.
You can reshare the screen.
Hang on. Ah, here we are. No, what am I doing? I seem to have lost. I can see Jerry, but oh hell! Forgive me.
That's okay. You can just post them. I want to read them and study them. So
okay. Look, what I've actually got, I'm just finishing a draft paper. It's actually 19,000 words, which is really the overview of how this arises, the full arguments, and noting, I don't mind sending it out, but you have to note that it's still in draft form. I will be sending it to a journal, but it will need criticism as usual, because we all rely on reviewer comments to see whether what we say makes sense. And this is one of the reasons why I'm presenting this to you, because I would like to see criticism. And that gives me an opportunity to defend it. So here we are. what do I do? Oh yeah, here we are. Okay, so right. So what I'll do, I'll send it to Jason, and I'll put on it not for distribution, except to the Club of Remy. And I would appreciate any comments that you may have.
Sure.
Is that okay,
Sure.
Jerry?
Oh, yeah, with me, it's fine. It's going to take some work to digest the way you put these together, so don't expect instantaneous feedback.
No. It is, it's actually a very complex argument. That's why it's taken 19,000 words, and it's partitioned. So it's taken me an awful lot of work to partition it into sizable chunks that can be digested. So what I've tried to do is partition the paper so that the first part is really talking about internalization and anticipation. The second part talks about the three theories. The third part then connects them, and then there's a long discussion.
Our 7 slides rule really gave Maurice a hard time. Apologize for that.
So in 10 or 15 minutes, I'm going to have to leave. But if anyone else has any questions, I know it's difficult to take in with this rushed presentation, which is very, very complex. But yeah, if anyone else has any questions, I'd be pleased to respond.
I would like to try, but my question is a baby level question, I guess. I have difficulty wrapping my head around in autopoiesis. Since you mentioned autopoiesis, I think the definition is informationally closed but organizationally open. Is that correct, or is it the other way around?
Yeah, well, because it's an internalized process. It's an internal process. That's right.
So did I correctly state it? An autopoietic system is informationally closed, organizationally open, or did I not?
Well, look, in my view, autopoiesis has a whole number of functions. The first is observation. So it observes context, and then it engages with a set of processes that transforms those observations into something that is cognitively sensible.
All right.
Yes, sorry.
Well, no, thank you, because I'm trying to put my finger on the what it is that I have a challenge with, and or a problem with, and I was wondering, it's the observing. Dus I can imagine a model in which you say the model observes and then decides, but that was what I wanted to know.
So
thank you. You
okay,
actually explained.
If you go to the traditional view, you have a meta system, if you want, which is the observer, and you've got the system in which there are objects that are observed. But the question then is, how does the observer observe? What is the mechanism that allows the observer to observe? And that is autopoiesis.
Yeah, and okay, thank you. And one day I will present an alternative.
Good, I look forward to hearing that.
No, what I mean to say, there is another way of thinking that puts an emphasis on the interaction. And that says the problem of the distinction between the observed and the observer is that is the wrong separation, because you have an artificial separation. And really the focus needs to be on the interaction. But I'll leave my question and I'll wait for another moment, because I don't want to interrupt the flow here by throwing in an alternative.
As you will.
Yeah.
I've got a very brief question, if I can, to Maurice. So I'm trying to find the reference, but again, I think it's from the Inactivists, who quote a little girl. She's asked to write something, and they ask what is she intending to write, and she comes back and says something like, "How will I know what I mean to write until I've written it?" And essentially meaning that she can't determine the meaning of what she's thinking until she's written it down, which is the point that an activists are trying to make. Is it's almost the reverse of everything that we see as logical. Does your system of cognition and autopoiesis work in reverse like that?
Yes.
Would that account for that?
Yes, exactly. That's why I've introduced the concept of anterior and posterior autopoiesis, because it works both ways. So you can actually generate something and then look at what you've done and then see if it works.
Yeah, I thought so. It's sort of coming through to it. It takes a bit of digesting there, Maurice.
Yeah, I know that. It took a bit of working out as well. Sorry, yes, Margaret.
It was in response to what Jonathan says, that they say it looks illogical, but that's the whole point. If it's logic that makes something look illogical, then we try out a different logic in which nothing looks illogical. So Maurice, what I'm looking for is, where is your own agency in this model? That is in general that I've been struggling with. I don't see the agents, and if I see agents, they're angry. I feel anger coming from the agents.
That's a very good question. The theory I've developed really is that agency is the living system, but agency has within it sub-agencies, it has within it agents. Agents have agents within them, whatever level you want, with its pure Simonism. So if one looks at the agency, then the agency has a meta system that is the regulator for the relationship between the meta system and the system, just as the meta system regulates the system. So we can have as many hierarchies as we want if they're sensible, and mostly they're not sensible. But if we have 3, then we have 2 levels of regulation. Now, in a traditional system where you have strategy and knowledge, then strategy is the regulator for behavior, and knowledge is the regulator for the relationship between strategy and the system behavior. Does that make sense? So that
yes,
does it make sense to say that what Jamie's saying is linear logic, but we're in an autopoietic system, which is circular logic?
That's right.
So what appears logical to you has to be from within the system where there's a paradox.
Yeah.
No, I think
Jonathan, now you're doing one of the little tricks of autopoiesis to kind of say linear logic versus something else. But
it's not a trick, no.
No, it is a trick, because the thing that we're trying to do is find a common ground. And by classifying half of the world as illogical, you don't get a common ground. You just continue with the binary. And I'm trying to figure out how we can move beyond the binary. So, Maurice, it was helpful what you said, but I still need to digest it. But okay. I don't think it's as easy as declaring the ones.
So when you come up and say it's a trick, Jamie, it's the same problem I'm having time and time again with autopoiesis with people, in that once and it's if you read Lerman, I mean, Lowett said, I've read Lerman for 30 years and I think I've wasted my life. The problem you have is once you get into a circularity, you are in a paradox. You cannot see out. So I think maybe we need a session to explain it very carefully, because it makes an awful lot of sense once you're inside it. It's the same reason I think I said to you, I sent you the email saying, the way you solve a paradox is to create another dimension. And that's the same thing that Maurice is talking about, I think. You're talking about being inside the dimension.
Yeah, but that is a way that you just framed the question, and I'm saying, well, there is okay, there is so we kind of agree on there is paradox, and that's a problem. But now the question is, where is the paradox coming from? And you say it's coming from circular reasoning.
The simple thing is, it comes from Gödel. It comes from Gödel, and that
no, it doesn't come
no
from
system
Gödel.
can describe itself.
Yeah. Can I say, where I see paradoxes coming from, they come from anywhere. I mean, not just people think and they say, gee, this is a contradiction. What shall I do next? And I don't see a need to immediately say, oh, now, sorry, I'm trying to understand why there is this interest in circular causality as a necessary component from the thinking. Because I totally agree with you, Maurice. We need to go to a different way of being to get out of the paradox. But I propose the word gestalt shift. And by the way, Maurice, that was the next question I was going to ask. Is the concept of gestalt shifting part of your model? Like that.
Sorry,
you look at this.
What was the word again?
Gestalt switch is actually the correct.
Well, maybe. You know, the thing is that once you get inside, you know, there are two dimensions. You know, once upon a time, one thought of simply the system and its regulator. But as soon as you move into higher orders of cybernetics, all things are possible. We start to get into crazy quantum equivalence, the crazy relationships that form in quantum mechanics that you can't really fathom. And when we're talking about higher order cybernetics, the original proposition that I presented in my Metacybernetics paper published a few months ago was that you can always generate a higher order, a new dimension, Jonathan, of cybernetics in order to explore that below, and that is a regulator of what comes below. And you can always have regulators of regulators. There is the internal of the agency, and there's the context, the reality. You know, this whole theory is critical realism. I've come across people who have wondered about this within constructivist context, but it doesn't work. You must have critical realism, and you must believe that there is a context out there that is real to some extent, is real, that you can touch, that you can actually measure, and that what goes on after that from observation is an internal process that can be extremely complex.
What do you mean by critical in your critical realism?
Well, if you can look at, if you go to my my 2016 book, that will define critical realism, or the paper in called Metacybernetics that was published with Systems a few months ago, that defines critical realism. So it defines, it relates constructivist processes with reality. So constructivism used to say reality is what you make it. But in critical realism, reality is what you make it, providing you can connect it with reality.
So the critical, who is being critical here? Is it the critical process, or is there someone criticizing?
Yes, it's a critical process because it has to take account of reality.
All right.
So I came across,
it comes from Bhaskar, I think, doesn't it?
That's right. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
So you can probably say, if a constructivist might say, different people have different streams of thought, and they're all relevant as each other. Whereas in my mindset theory, in the book that was just published, it says that in the mind, and this isn't a promotion, I'm sorry. In the mind, there is, you can actually find pathologies, identity pathologies, which actually cause mental blockages or problems of thinking. So in the constructivist view, you can say, we all have relevant and just as valid processes of thinking, and therefore Trump's thinking process is just as relevant as Jonathan's or Jason's, okay? But if you then come to a theory that says, if you can examine the mental construct of individuals, and if you can find there are pathologies there, then there are differences, and you can't assume that the constructivist vision is actually adequate. Is that?
Yeah, and now maybe one last question. I mean, I for me at least, for me now, discursive processes, do they play a role, like critical in being the talking and the listening, just in terms of system updating itself? What is the role of discursive processes?
Well, that's, everything is possible. Everything is, if putting it in traditional terms, it's all about observation and communication, and that occurs between agency and context, and part of context is other agencies, is other agents.
Any more questions for Maurice before we let you go?
Yes, I have one question, briefly. Maurice, if I look at your, after listening to your recent comments following your paper, I get the very strong intuition that you have taken its background, either knowingly or unknowingly, the basic conceptualizations of compositions from category theory and adapted those in terms of probabilistic events, which may or may not occur, and that you're dealing then with different levels of composition in this notion of metasystem, and system with respect to the regulations of those systems. Yeah. In other words, I find it very close. My feeling is that Andre Erisman's work is probably quite relevant to what you're talking about.
I think you're probably right. I have come across category theory, but I haven't particularly used it. If there's a juncture between them, my work and that, then it's coincidental, or it might have been in some subconscious parts of my mind, I don't know. But the theories that I've developed have really stemmed from Eric Schwartz's ideas and an amplification of those. So I've taken Eric Schwartz's thought processes much further, but he must be really highlighted as the innovator, and I'm just so sorry that he was never recognized sufficiently for what he'd done.
I understand that Eric Schwartz, who you're aware of, I knew and discussed some of these issues with. And no, it would be probably, he was not a mathematician, he was a physicist.
No, and that's right.
He really, I don't know of any efforts that he made to relate his work to the forms of category theory and consciousness that were later developed. So thank you very much.
Yeah,
thank you.
Well, I have maybe a more fundamental question. Maybe it's also that I don't quite understand what you're saying. Think about autopoiesis. Literally, it means self-production. And if you look at Maturana, it is a network of components that interact in order to produce the components that make the network working. Now, it is the relationship of production which is under the circularity, which is underlying it. But you shift that towards observation. That is a totally different kind of process. Now, from a logical point of view, you can do all kinds of things, but it is really a disservice to the idea of self-production. And I do not think, cannot make this connection. I might want to also mention that, I mean, you're looking always at representation, and it's my old subject that when we think of language as being representative, we always get into these abstractions that something is about, and that is actually not the case. For example, for a body that produces its parts in order to continue. So there is no, the logic is making these paradoxes, but not the facts.
Okay. Self-production doesn't actually define physical self-production. It's components of itself. These can be physical components or they can be cognitive components, so it can go either way. In the way I've defined it, because I've defined two components that are inherent in the three-dimensional model that I use, and this actually relates very much to Piaget's work, and with observing a subject playing with pebbles, rearranging the pebbles and seeing if that means anything, etc., etc. This is a two-way process. So autopoiesis as self-production can either be a change in the physical relationships, or it can be a change in the cognitive relationships that occur. No one has ever said that autopoiesis necessarily must relate to physical components. And if we then go back to Forster's work and Rocher's representation of that, anticipation does not come into his recursive equations. And anticipation is fundamental for living systems. So how do we move on? What Forster's done is said, well, here we have internalization, because that's what he's actually doing, because it's a recursive equation, because the current situation is a reflection of the past. But how do we bring the future in? Now, Dubois has done that. And that has strong implications, because Dubois' work is all about anticipation. And that leads to future. And that's what living systems is about. So there has to be a lack in Forster's work.
Maurice, I follow your argument, but nevertheless, Klaus's viewpoint, in my opinion, has a certain intrinsic validity to it, that both of the internal and both the physical and the mental are necessary, and neither alone is sufficient.
I agree.
Well, if I may say, a biological system doesn't think. There are parts in the biological system that relate to the environment, and that thinking comes out. But what the Maturana contributed is that from a, you say physical, I would say biological point of view, it is a network of various components, and somehow without instructions, without anticipation, without even knowing whether it's worth it, they produce parts that that allow this network to continue. There is no anticipation. Biological systems rarely ever can be explained in terms of anticipation. That is a cognitive process. It's not a process of reproduction.
Actually, it is a basic biological process. The paper that I posted in the chat, if you take the time to read it, you might get a hint. It won the best paper award in robotics at the computing anticipatory systems that Dubois conducted. And so to say that fundamental biological systems, even down to the cellular level, do not employ anticipation is a wrong statement.
Well, in anticipation, maybe I should have been more specific. I mean, the issue of goal direction or something like this. Yes, any sort of anticipation, meaning actually an extrapolation of the past into the future, that is certainly true in biological systems. But it is, evolution had the consequence of producing organisms that can survive. But the survival is not part of the constitution of the biological system, that is a side effect of the evolution, and the biology has nothing to say about that.
Well, take a look at the paper.
Well, I don't have it, so.
And also, Maurice,
George.
Pete actually asked you if you could share your draft paper with us.
So, George, I think your paper, it was about a conference on robotics. So, so this brings up another dimension. It is we as humans, we are telling stories and we're doing things with the material world. And I think that is the sort of question that Klaus is getting at, how we produce our stories and how we acknowledge our own agency. And if we just strictly talk in representational terms, we actually don't see the creative processes, our own imagination. That's not just anticipation, that is active creative imagining of a future. And the biological system, that is actually a model. That's not the reality, that's a model. And then what happens in reality, that depends on how well we understand reality. But that is something else than observing. No, to understand reality, today we rely on all the models that were created before us, but also all the discursive processes, all the arguing and the thinking and the listening and the talking, and that we don't really acknowledge how important all these discursive processes are, and that we immediately go into the anticipation without acknowledging the interactions. Anyway, that was my.
Yeah, the paper was given in the robotics section of the conference. It was a large conference. However, my program is based on the notion that we start with understanding the simpler biological processes. The robot actually emulated the behavior of a real animal. So it was an autonomous vehicle. It started with the actual idea that anticipation, the capacity to build models that can be used to anticipate future states, begins actually at the synapse and how the synapses actually learn. So I threw out everything anybody was saying about neural networks and started to try to simulate the biological processes. And it led to a very, I call it a moronic snail, because it was based on the brain architecture of a mollusk, and it worked very well. The problem with it is, and if you read the paper, you may have the exact same reaction to it. Holy mackerel, what is this all about? Because the people who have been working in AI, for example, have no clue, with the exception of Jeff Hawkins, I think, have no clue as to the fact that of even what intelligence is, let alone how to produce it. So I went back and said, the way we're going to do this is to emulate biological, real neurons, real synapses. And the whole basis of my dissertation, for example, was to ferret out the dynamics of efficacy changes in synaptic junctions. And it just led to the well, that whole program. So that was back in 1999, that paper. And what had happened, I'll just explain quickly, because I love what Maurice is doing, from the standpoint that this is an abstract mathematical version. What I wanted to do is produce an implementation that actually demonstrated. I started with Rosen and went from there. I didn't know about Dubois until the conference. All right, I've said enough.
Can I say something? I mean, George, you mentioned, I think correctly, we don't know what intelligence is. or at least many people have different kind of views, anticipation is not necessarily intelligence. It means simply there's a history and you extrapolate. That is not intelligence.
I didn't
Not to
say,
me.
I did not
Actually-
say it was intelligent.
No, but I'm
It's
saying that
used to
anticipation is
accomplish
too
it.
limited as a concept
What
to
I-
relate us
what
to
I've done-
intelligence.
What
It's
I've
not
done
Can I,
enough.
can I suggest that both people are right? Klaus was right in his statement that autopoiesis does. Manturan and Varela actually reversed their opinion and said that autopoiesis was only biological, although Varela subsequently changed it and moved on to the embodied mind. But it has been taken up since by the inactivists who have taken the concept of autopoiesis and turned it into one of autonomy, because it got so controversial about trying to apply it to other areas. But I think Peter Beer recently applied it to the game of life, and using Manturan and Varela's first formulations prove that the game of life is autopoietic. So I think there's a lot of dimensions to the discussion going on, and both people are right. Anticipation is something, if you look at the viable systems model, no system can remain viable, no organism could remain viable without a system for an inability to anticipate its environment.
And in fact, if you look at Piaget's work, he talks about figurative and operative intelligence, and these are, in my view, versions of autopoiesis and what Schwartz calls autogenesis. Anyway, I've written about that, but I have to leave now. My apologies. Thank you for all the feedback. I will send Jason the paper for comments. You were saying? Anybody? Okay. Bye.
Thank you very much.